Right. Welcome everyone to the SEA Professional Development on Dealing with Grief. We have three presenters here with us today. Morgan Fagioli currently serves as a program officer at the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of Education and Cultural Affairs, where she supports the International Visitor Leadership Program, the department's premier professional exchange program. Morgan holds a bachelor's degree in East Asian languages and cultures from Indiana University and a master's in public administration and international education management from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. She currently resides in Arlington. Amy Marcus is a program manager and facilitator currently working on projects at the intersection of international education and climate change. She holds a master's degree in public administration and international education management from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and a bachelor's degree in international studies from Vassar College. Amy has trained individuals and teams on climate-related topics, consulted for small businesses, and presented at various conferences. She currently lives in San Francisco Bay Area. And then Shayna Trujillo has over 11 years of experience as a project and partnerships manager with a core focus on prioritizing equity, accessibility, and inclusion. She holds a project management and professional certificate, an MA in international education management, and a BA in sociology and anthropology. Shayna is the learning and development specialist at AIR and has presented at local, national, and international conferences. She currently lives in the Austin area. So without further ado, I will turn the time over to our presenters so we can get started.
Thanks so much, Justin. And thank you, to Tim, Katie Davidson, everyone for helping make this possible. We're really happy to be here today. My name is Amy Marcus, and your colleague, Katie Davidson, and I are members of the same Climate Action Book Club. And she graciously invited my co-presenters and myself to bring this session to you all. We've presented similar workshops in a few different settings now, one at a conference, and are excited to be with you all today. So thank you. So my co-presenters and I are all international education professionals and friends from grad school a number of years ago. You may have heard that in our bios. We all went to the Middlebury Institute. And in 2020 and 2021, we all experienced sudden, significant loss of a loved one within about 6 months of each other. And after our losses, we faced similar challenges in navigating our grief at work, yet we all stumbled upon the same really useful resources and wanted to share them with our larger networks because we knew it would be useful both to folks experiencing loss directly and to those supporting grievers. The reality is that the complexity of grief can be really overwhelming and intimidating for both the person directly affected by grief and for those wanting to support them. Most of our session today is based on the work of Megan Devine, a psychotherapist specializing in grief, who helps redefine what's considered normal grief and removing the stigma around the topic. We draw primarily from her book entitled It's Okay That You're Not Okay. And while her work focuses on losing people, many of the lessons apply to the loss of pets, opportunities, jobs, and more. Now, we are not mental health professionals, but we realized, honestly, that just in the last week, we've each been able to more effectively support each other or someone else in our circles who recently lost someone because we were familiar with and had ourselves benefited from Devine's work. In my case, I lost my mother suddenly overnight in December 2020. It was a completely unexpected loss, and it hurt to not be able to say goodbye. I struggled to figure out how to function in the following weeks and what was normal. And now I will pass it to Shayna to share a bit about her experience.
Hi, everybody. I'm Shayna Trujillo. Thanks, Amy, for getting us started. In my case, my younger brother died after an intense and sudden mental health crisis in May of 2021. So 3 years ago this month. It feels like both yesterday and a really long time ago. So I particularly struggled with how to feel and process my own grief while also supporting my parents, my sister, my husband, my young kids in their grieving as well. So today we hope that sharing some of our stories and the resources we've used will help you in any context that you may find yourself in. Morgan?
Thanks, Shayna. Good afternoon. My name is Morgan Fagioli. And I lost my mom in July 2021 after spending about 2 weeks in the ICU with her, rotating visits with my dad and brother due to the COVID time restrictions. Despite constant advocating, we felt as though her medical team did not listen to her or take her symptoms seriously, and I developed a great mistrust in the hospital system. At the time, I had recently started a new position with the federal government, and I couldn't help but to think what would have happened if I had been working overseas at the time. In my previous roles, I had been responsible for the health and safety of high schoolers abroad. How would I have coped to support them when I was unable to support myself? Experiencing this traumatic loss and how it affected me also made me reflect on past situations of both colleague and student experienced grief and how I could have better supported them. Next slide, please, Shayna. So today for our agenda, we will begin with some historical and cultural context notes, and then also discuss common grief manifestations and informed responses. After that, we will go through a number of potential scenarios together and explore ways to respond. For that, we will be using the poll feature in Zoom. And finally, we will discuss some general resources to support those who are grieving, as well as some Utah State University specific resources as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So today, we do want to say that we are looking at grief specifically through the cultural lens of the United States. We want to acknowledge that every culture has very unique qualities and traditions when it comes to moving through grief, just as every individual processes grief differently. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the reactions tool if something we say resonates with you. And also please feel free to share in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so. Now, jumping into our culture of grief. First, I want to say thank you for even being here. Grief is not a subject that many choose to talk about, and in most cases, it is avoided at all costs. In the professional world, we are lucky if we have bereavement leave, but still the time provided, if any, is never enough. Our culture puts a time limit on our loss and expects that we move on as quickly as possible. In her book, Megan Devine, the psychotherapist that Amy mentioned earlier, dives into our culture as one that really just doesn't understand grief. As humans, we're driven to want to support others and solve problems. But what happens if you can't solve someone's grief? What happens if the story just won't work out in the end? Loss does not fit into the belief that every story has a happy ending. The reality is that there is no solution because grief isn't a problem to solve. Megan says grieving people are met with impatience precisely because they are failing the cultural storyline of overcoming adversity. If you don't transform, if you don't find something beautiful inside this, you've failed. And if you don't do it quickly, following the narrative arc from incident to transformation within our collective attention span, you're not living the right story. That's from page 34. You may have heard of the stages of grief theory, introduced in 1969 by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. This model was actually created during her research of terminally ill patients coming to terms with their illness and their own mortality. Since then, the use of the model has been expanded. And while the stages may be relevant to those who are grieving their own mortality, and some areas may align to other types of grief, grief is very personal, and it certainly does not follow a linear process. Next slide, please, Shane. Another way to think about grief is within these three models: medical model, psychological model, and cultural. While these may sound familiar or relatable, we do want to note that we do not agree with them. None of these models really feel accurate or appropriate during a time of loss, and they end up making it more difficult for a griever or a supporter. Given these cultural norms, maybe you have experienced some of these common barriers for those wanting to help. Feel free to react with the reaction tool if any of these following lines sound familiar. Perhaps a loved one not knowing what to say and ultimately saying nothing. Perhaps being afraid to bring up the loss and fearing of triggering strong emotions. struggling with feelings of guilt, expecting grief to be a short-term response, expecting grievers to just get over it, and expecting grievers to follow the stereotypical stages of grief. As education professionals, we often preach that we want our students to step out of their comfort zones and be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And this really goes for grief too. In order to be the best support for our students, our colleagues, and ourselves, it's important that we talk about death before, during, and after it happens. And I'll pass it over to Amy.
Thank you, Morgan. We have a really quick poll just as a check-in for all of you. Which of the following are examples of typical responses to grief? Check all the things that could happen are normal or that someone could exhibit. So we'll give you a minute to go through those.
My bad. I accidentally ended the poll thinking I was submitting my results there. So please go on again and resubmit those results.
No worries. Thanks, Tim. All right. I'll give you a few more moments to submit your answers, and then we'll close it out. We seeing good numbers there, Shayna? We're getting responses? Oh, amazing. Okay. Look at you all. So pretty much we see that all of the above are very common in grief, as you may have guessed. So we'll dive into this a little bit on the next slide. We're going to take a closer look at what grief can look and sound like. So one of the challenges in understanding grief is that it can manifest itself in an infinite number of ways. One stereotype is that grieving individuals are quiet and maybe avoid people, which happens, but in many cases it's the opposite and the griever is quite talkative. Some may struggle to get out of bed, while others may use nonstop activity as a way to distract themselves from the loss, which is also okay. Many continue to refer to the lost loved one in the present tense. Some may overeat while others undereat. Some may oversleep or struggle with insomnia. And across all those binaries is everything in between and changing every day. So you can't even expect someone's grief to manifest itself in the same way every day. It can be all over the place. And then on a physical level, grief affects your appetite, your digestion, blood pressure, your heart rate, your breath, your sleep, like we mentioned, and even your muscle fatigue. It's wild. It really affects everything. And finally, something that we found particularly surprising was that grief has a neurological effect on the body, resulting in issues like the inability to concentrate, inability to recall recent events or complete basic tasks. And these neurological effects can last for years, which is really important to keep in mind. And for those who are unable to deeply process and sit with their grief in the moment closer to when it happens, these physical and neurological effects can last a lifetime. So, seeing all of those various manifestations of grief may sound overwhelming. So you may be wondering how you can possibly support someone experiencing all of this. But the most important thing to remember is that grief is an experience to support, not a problem to solve. And I'm just going to repeat that one because it's a really big one. That was a game changer for us, which is that grief is an experience to support, not a problem to solve. So what does that look like more specifically though? You can consider setting yourself calendar reminders for key dates. So you can reach out to them to tell them you're thinking of them on big dates like holidays, anniversaries, birthdays. You might be afraid to do so out of fear of saying the wrong thing or reminding them of their grief. That's a really common one. But honestly, they're already thinking about their grief every day. So being shown support is priceless. You can also use reminders as regular check-ins to not lose track of them. Even receiving a heart emoji via text made each of us feel loved and cared for in those early days. And it meant we knew we could reach out to those individuals to talk. And Morgan recently told me how she appreciated that I had texted her periodically in the weeks after she lost her mom to remind her to drink water. So really simple things. Second, try to avoid comparisons. Everyone's experience of grief and everyone's loss is unique. So it's totally natural for us to want to relate, right? So we dig up our past experiences to try to help. For example, one I received after I lost my mom was, oh, my mom died when I was 6, so I know exactly what you're going through. But while the intention is good, the result is often off-putting and can feel really minimizing or irrelevant. So try to focus on the current loss and how you can support them in this moment. And when it comes to advice, just because something worked for you doesn't mean it will work for others. So try to be understanding and supportive of how they need to grieve. Another option is to take care of everyday tasks, which of course depends on your relationship with the person, but you can pick up the mail, drop off or deliver food, send gift cards, or schedule necessary appointments. I know when I lost my mom, it was really thoughtful to me that my coworkers pitched in to send me a gift card to Sunbasket, a meal delivery service specializing in organic foods and sustainable packaging, which really aligns with my interests and values and provided a whole bunch of healthy meals for my husband and me. The key here is to do non-invasive, reversible tasks. So you may feel inclined to do the laundry, for example, or clean a bedroom, but that pile of laundry might be the only clothes they have from the lost loved one. So you want to avoid doing non-reversible tasks like that without their explicit permission or request. And then in speaking with the griever, make space for them to share as much or as little as they would like. Many of us think that we should avoid the topic of the lost person, but sometimes it's really comforting to hear others speak fondly about them, even if you didn't know that person very well. I know people would say, I know the way you spoke about your mom means that, like, I knew she was a really nice person, or I heard so many people speak highly of her. Even if you didn't meet them, it still can be really comforting. So as much as you can, just follow the lead of the griever, listen, and support without inserting your own opinions or especially being critical. And then similarly, do your best to honor each person's individual needs, their way of grieving, and their timeline. Every loss is unique with different timing, relationships, circumstances, and histories. So of course, like I mentioned briefly, a lot of what we've discussed here depends on your relationship to the griever. And many of these examples are for people you're close to on a personal level, but don't worry, we'll get to some specific professional sphere examples shortly. So to close this section, we'd like to share a quote from Megan Devine's book that we feel sums it up nicely. When a bone is broken, it needs a supportive cast around it to help it heal. It needs external support so it can go about the intricate, complex, difficult process of growing itself back together. Your task is to be part of that cast for your broken friend, not to do the actual mending. Your job, should you choose to accept it, is to bear witness to something beautiful and terrible, and to resist the very human urge to fix it or make it right. And that's hard. So now I'll pass it to Shayna to walk us through some professional scenarios.
That quote every time hits me really hard and is really relevant. I just want to acknowledge the fact that some people have been sharing things in the chat, and I appreciate your candor and interest in this topic. And I think it's a great acknowledgement of the fact that we often never know what's going on behind someone's, professional life or their work. And many of us have experienced really intense, tough grief situations. And sometimes it just takes that first step to kind of admit it, especially in this kind of US cultural context, to say, I am going through something hard, or I have been through something hard. We're going to shift gears into, like Amy said, these professional scenarios, some things that you might encounter at Utah State. I will read the scenarios out loud, and then we'll launch the poll with some possible actions that you might take in response to the situation. Some of the example actions are less than ideal. Some feel like gut reactions to you. Just take a moment to consider each one. So for scenario 1, One of your students recently completed an internship, which on the surface went very smoothly. In speaking with the student about their experience, however, you learned that their time working on their project was quite triggering because it reminded them of their close family member who passed away 5 years ago. What actions might you take today in response to learning that? So I'm going to launch the poll and give you guys some time to respond and then show the answers. These are anonymous and they're, yeah. Give you a few more seconds. You know, if people haven't answered yet, just want to give them time to read and think. No one is going to be called out for these. That might be everybody. So interesting that the first three were the ones that you guys were most interested. Glad you listened to what Amy said though about avoiding comparisons. But anyway, what we really wanted to highlight with this scenario is the phrase, reach out if you need anything. It's super common, very, very common. But it's often a little bit too general for people to know how to respond to it, especially if the loss is very personal. So as we know, or have maybe you just learned, grief typically affects people on the neurological level, meaning that they may be experiencing that mental load or the brain fog. I think one of you guys mentioned that in the chat, and it can be unmanageable. In grief, especially early grief, the individual may literally be unable to know what they need, how to ask for it. So it's not necessarily that like they don't want to bother you or that they don't appreciate your offer, but more likely, no, they might not be able to literally cannot manage responding to that offer of help. I know for myself, I feel like I was in a brain fog for over a year. And when I finally started waking up, it was like recognizing that I had been operating on this like totally incapacitated level for a really long time. So if this is the situation you find yourself in, or it happens to yourself, try to think about concrete, specific actions that you could suggest. So for example, do you have plans with friends for the evening? Let's make sure you're fed. Do you want Chinese or Indian food? You could offer to send them something like that. Or I'd like to be able to check on you. Do you mind sharing your phone number so I can send you a message every now or then? And then actually give yourself reminders to check in on that person if you need it. Again, this depends on your relationship with the person. Obviously, power dynamics come into play as well, but specific regular actions are really important. And as you guys know, telling someone that, or someone you know, that they feel the same way is a tough one because every loss is really unique. And sharing about someone else's loss can feel too far removed or almost as if you're making the grief about you instead of about the person experiencing the grief. So if you focus on the grieving person, their current experience, their unique loss, that's really important. And just as a specific example, my sister and I, we both lost our brother, but the way that we needed help, the way that we experienced grief, the things we wanted to talk about and how we wanted to talk about them were very different. So just keep that in mind as you, if you're ever in a situation like this. For our next scenario, you and a colleague are in a work meeting when they mention that another staff member just found out that their partner had passed away suddenly. This severe and unexpected loss shakes you as you are also acquainted with this person's partner. The colleague you're speaking with says they're really worried about doing or saying the wrong thing, but feels like you should do something. What might you do for yourself, and what advice might you give to this colleague? So I'm going to launch the poll. And again, we'll take about a minute to read through the answers and respond. About 10 more seconds. I know we were forcing you to just pick one option. So you guys have the challenge. It was on purpose. So we have people across the gambit of what they're interested in doing. And this is normal. Everybody's going to respond differently to this kind of a situation. But what we want to highlight here is it's important to address your own emotions and grief while also taking action for the people who are directly impacted. So it's a really tough situation to be in. And sometimes in the United States, grief can really feel comparative or like a competition, where one loss or one experience of grief is worse than another, or maybe like I shouldn't be feeling grief because it wasn't my partner who passed away. In reality, everyone involved or touched or dealing with some form of grief, and all of those versions of grief are valid. They're not the same, but they are all valid. And they might be different, they might feel different, but wasting your energy on comparing or placing one kind of grief below or another, or giving yourself grief, it's the wrong use of the word grief, but giving yourself problems or feeling guilty because of the way that you're feeling is not going to be useful. We just want you to know that it is normal to take one and need to take care of yourself while also being there for others. I also want to acknowledge the fact that this is really complicated. And I had to do a lot of that when being with my family, being with my kids, like how do you explain what like death is to like little kids while you're also feeling it yourself. So there are all sorts of complex things that happen in every one of these situations. And any of these responses could work. All of them could work together. Giving people space by not reaching out to someone only serves you. It does not serve the griever. So we're going to go to our next scenario. We're going to imagine in this scenario that you're a program advisor on campus and you're so proud of your students who recently returned from a year-long program abroad because they bonded really deeply with their host families and the local community. One of the students comes to you quite upset though, because their classmate's host father has suddenly passed away back in the host country. Consider this student the classmate whose host father has passed away and or the rest of the cohort when you're thinking about responding to these. So what actions might you take in this moment? I'm going to launch our third poll. Okay, we're going to give about 10 more seconds. Okay. So first of all, we have a specific resource from Heather for the Student of Concern reporting system that USU has. So that sounds really cool. And I appreciate that none of you guys were trying to steer the conversation away from grief. So thanks for avoiding that. We did stick in a few sticky answers here. It's a really challenging situation, and most of these responses really might be the right one in the moment. We just want to highlight here the value of reminding grievers that they have options and encourage them to seek out what is right for them in that moment. So whether that's talking to someone, whether that's removing themselves, whether that's journaling, or whether that's, you know, talking to a psychiatrist, there's lots of different ways to deal with those moments and those feelings. And the way that you say these options is also super important. Are you going to convey a feeling of dismissal? Like, are you directing, oh, here's the student resources, you need to go do that right now? kind of dismissing them and their concerns and the fact that they brought it to you? Or are you providing space within that conversation to really share how people are feeling? So tone is of course important, and we're not going to get it right every time, but keep that in mind. In any response, also just remind yourself to follow up and figure out how they ended up taking action. And maybe they might need help picking an action, and that could be something that you do for them. Might just depend on the situation. Okay. So we're going to go to scenario 4. Your teammate has been looking forward to and working very hard to prepare to apply for a specialized prestigious program at work for over a year. They've completed the application, received recommendation letters, and their staff managers sign off to participate. A week before selecting the chosen cohort, it's announced the program has been canceled due to funding cuts. Your colleague is devastated by this loss. So in what ways might you respond to your teammate's loss? I'm going to launch the poll. Okay, we can give another 10 seconds there. We responded pretty quickly to this one. Okay.
This one's a little more straightforward.
Yeah. All right, I'll share our results here. So again, thank you for participating in these polls. While we have spent most of our time today talking about the death of a loved one, this example really illustrates that grief can come from the loss of many things, whether that's an experience, a job, sometimes even a feeling. Not all losses are the same, but the feeling of grief is equally valid. And again, we might fall into this trap pretty easily of this US cultural context of trying to cheer some up. Oh, it's not that bad, or you'll get a chance next year to do it again. But that can feel really invalidating to the person who's still in that feeling at that moment. I know it's really, I really struggle with doing this with my kids when they're feeling something really intensely and not pulling them out of it, because they're still feeling it right now. It's still valid in that moment. So if you find yourself or someone you know in this kind of a situation, most of you guys said that you would avoid trying to cheer them up and just hear about it. You know, a simple "that sucks, you want to talk" can sometimes be the best option, and providing that space for everybody else. So I know these scenarios were a lot and maybe brought some things up for you guys. I know some of you shared things in the chat. So thank you for doing that. But I'm going to pass it to Amy again, I think.
Yeah. Thank you, Shayna. Thank you, everyone, for your participation in those. I know they can be tricky. It's good, I think, to just go through and sort of take a moment to think about how you might handle them. So really appreciate you all taking the time. So we wanted to provide a bunch of resources for you all. We'll start with ones available to the broader public. We'll be sending out these resources in a follow-up email, but this is a quick peek at some of the really fantastic resources that we've found useful and that Megan Devine recommends as well. So obviously we have a whole bunch of links to Megan Devine's work. She has her website, she has her book and a journal. She's on Instagram if you prefer it that way, and she also has a podcast. There's some sites related to What's Your Grief, and a book there, and then podcasts. And there are amazing resources for specific kinds of loss. So families with children, for example, Shayna with her children, supporting them and dealing with their grief, their shared loss of a loved one. Resources for folks who lose a child, baby loss, etc. There's all these different resources for different kinds of loss, which I think is really remarkable. And on the next slide, we wanted to make sure we shared some USU specific resources. And as Shayna had called out earlier, someone shared in the chat a really good one there, the Student of Concern reporting system. Thank you, Heather. She says the school has excellent resources for students who are affected by the loss of a loved one to get help navigating, getting connected to therapists, or getting help with absences in schoolwork. So that sounds really, really great. You all also have benefits through Aetna. You have the Employee Assistance Program, or EAP, which apparently has articles, webinars, both recorded and live, and a whole bunch more. You have your Beneficiary Assist counseling services. And I know, at least in my previous roles, a lot of times the EAP program or various counseling services only allowed 6 sessions or 8 sessions, something limited like that per year. But I found even that amount was really helpful just to get through like immediate support or support at a difficult time of year, like the holidays. So even if, don't discount it is what I'm trying to say. You might think, oh, just 6 sessions with someone I just met, that's not worth it. But I found it really helpful in intense times. So it is worth checking out if you find yourself in that position. You also have your Aggies Thrive website. And then 2 quick notes here, which is that you have 3 days of bereavement leave, but while it isn't written explicitly in the policy, you can use sick leave for bereavement. You just need to ask for it. So make sure you ask for it and advocate for yourself if you can, or advocate for your colleagues. Remind them that that's an option. So to wrap up, you don't have to be the support person for everyone in your life who experiences grief, whether personally or professionally. However, we hope that you will have the tools, should you choose to be that person, or to support your friends or colleagues who need to be that person for others. Sometimes people choose to stay silent because they're worried about reminding the griever of their loss. But please don't let that stop you. As I can say with confidence, the griever has not and will not forget their loss. Any kind of outreach is better than no outreach. As Megan shares, no one knows the right thing to say. That's why it's important to have these dialogues, not so that we get it right, but so that we do it better. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we have the entire hour, so if anyone would like to stick around, share anything else in the chat, ask questions, we're here. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yes, thank you very much. That was fantastic. And yeah, let's open it up to questions out there. If anybody would like to chime in, feel free to take yourself off mute, or you can throw something in the chat and we'll respond that way.
I have a question. My mother passed away 4 years ago, and we were very close. And my sister and I were talking about some things right after her death, about papers and I don't know, just, you know, she said, "Do you remember when we went through Mother's clothes?" And I said, "I don't remember any of that." And she said, "You don't?" And I go, "No, it's just a big blur. I vaguely remember singing at her funeral. But things that she mentioned to me, I don't recall a thing that she was." Is that normal? Go through a fog like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll we're not counselors or psychotherapists ourselves, but at least from our experience, I know we all had some version of that. I think that's really common, to just have your memory blur and have trouble remembering events. I'll let Shayna or Morgan share as well.
I can relate to that a lot, Kathleen. I think when my mom passed away, it was a scurry to go through all of her things and try to set my dad up for success, and it was a blur. And in some ways, I think it's maybe our bodies trying to put us in a better place. I think our brains kind of do that to help ourselves, to try to lessen the pain. But that is a really good point.
I thought maybe I was nuts because I couldn't remember. And she said, "Remember this?" And I said, "Lynn, I don't remember." She said, "Remember when we cleaned out the garage and everything?" And I go, "Nope, I don't remember. I just knew it was done." But
that's one of the things that's so hard about grief is these things are happening to you and you feel so alone, or like you're the only one this is happening to, even years later, right? So you're not in the immediate loss right now, but you're a few years out and you're like, am I crazy? Have I, what's wrong with me? But there's nothing wrong with you. This is a very common response. Shayna.
Well, and that's part of the reason why we're doing these sessions. Part of the reasons why we were motivated to not just connect with each other around our own grief experiences, but we work in this field of education where we're interacting with people and taking care of people, and everybody experiences loss. And if you never knew that neurological symptoms are 100% common for everybody experiencing deep grief, you would think that you're crazy and isolated and alone, because the US context forces us to kind of get over it or present the smile or, whatever. It's really, really complicated. And part of our rationale for continuing to do these sessions in different formats and with different groups is because the more people that know that this is normal, the more people can reach out with appropriate, compassionate responses.
Thank you for sharing, Kathleen.
I think something that this conversation reminded me of, I mentioned in the chat that some people may have noticed that I lost my nephew suddenly about 5 years ago when he was 15. And that was the first time really where I'd had to deal with anybody that close to me in a sudden loss type experience, and especially my brother and my nephew being so young and all that. And I didn't know how to reach out and support my brother, and was worried about, and even afterwards, like on his birthday or on the anniversary of his death and things like that. And quickly, but I don't know if it was that quickly, but came to realize that they're not going to forget about that. Like, it's already on their mind. And so me bringing it up or stopping by or checking in and worrying about, like, bringing bad memories to the surface or something like that is just me overthinking it, essentially. Like, just reaching out and checking in and whatnot and being there, I think has been beneficial. Not that I, have any idea whether I've navigated this situation correctly or not, but certainly have felt that when I've stopped worrying about, my feelings or concerns and just being there, that's been helpful.
And you can still do that. You can still say, hey, I was thinking about him today. What have you thought about him today? Like that overture. And even saying people's names is so powerful. It's so powerful. So, there's always, well, at least, yeah, I'll stop there.
And they've done a great job of keeping his memory alive. They created a golf tournament, memorial golf tournament in his name, because he played on the golf team in high school, and some different, so they give out a scholarship and do different things in the community. So it's been cool to see that grow. But yeah, definitely, you can definitely tell that they're trying hard to keep his memory alive and not let that fade.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thanks, Tim. And to your point, I think you might be afraid to say something, but it's on their mind. And it can almost be a relief to have someone else say it. Because I think in those early days, at least I sometimes felt like I was going to be a burden if I mentioned it to whoever I was talking to. Like I was being the Debbie Downer, or like I couldn't get over it, or I couldn't think about anything else. So to have someone else say, how are you doing? And or I was thinking about your mom, or what have you, just opens the window and just kind of was relieving, because then I didn't have to feel like I was holding this thing in, and it was also really encouraging. So anyway, that was my experience.
I know at some point you all mentioned when people will like come and tell stories about that person, even if they like didn't know them super well. And my dad passed last summer suddenly, And that was a really like beautiful part of that, is just like hearing the impact he had on other people, or hearing stories too of like things that I just didn't know about yet, getting to know him in another way through these other relationships he had. That was a really lovely part of that process.
Thanks for sharing, Katie. I'm glad you had that. Yeah. I remember people coming to me in those first few weeks saying, I was just on the phone with your mom last Thursday, or I was just on the phone with her. It's like, how did you have time to talk to all these people? Like, it turned, I learned so much more about her afterwards from these different angles, where I didn't realize she had these different relationships, and just how much she was supporting all these other people that I didn't even realize. And it can be really, it's hard. Of course, it's bittersweet, but it's, in the long term, I think, really lovely. Yeah.
Well, Amy, Morgan, Shayna, thank you very much for your time today. I already received an email from someone who was in attendance but had to take off, and wanted me to express their appreciation as well. And yeah, just really appreciate you taking the time and sharing. Any other thoughts or comments from those out there before we end the meeting? Awesome. Well, thank you again. We did record this, so we keep track of these employee development seminars and put them up on our YouTube page. So we will send out the slides that you shared and a link to this video once it's posted. And certainly you three are welcome to make use of that any way that you see fit as well. I'll send it your way. But thank you again for your time today, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
opportunity, and really appreciate everyone being so open.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you.